We're gonna give everyone just a minute to get settled or two. We'll probably start around 8:33.
Kelly, you're
Hi,
muted.
everyone. Thank you. We're gonna give it just a minute before we get started to let everyone get settled in. We're gonna start in probably just one more minute. Thanks, everyone. If you'd like, feel free to introduce yourself to the chat, and feel free to change your name, affiliation, pronouns, by clicking the three dots next to your video or picture. Alrighty. It is 8:34, so I am going to get started. Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly Sherman. I'm the manager of Waterfront Design at Boston Harbor Now. I use she, her pronouns. And I'll be the host for this morning's forum. Boston Harbor Now convenes these meetings to enable public discussions about the projects happening around the waterfront, whether they're led by a public or private sector. If this is your first time at a Harbor Use Public Forum, welcome. If you have attended before, we're glad to have you back. Boston Harbor Now is a nonprofit focused on ensuring that the waterfront and harbor islands are increasingly prepared for the impacts of climate change and provide welcoming and inclusive open access indoor uses to people from all over Boston. We call this vision of an equitable, resilient, and accessible waterfront harbor walk 2.0. Our work spans a wide range of issues, from commenting on waterfront development projects to planning for future ferry service to bringing underserved communities out to experience the harbor islands. Boston Harbor Now believes strongly that the waterfront belongs to all of us, and bringing together interactive conversations like this, we can help ensure that projects are both inclusive and resilient. Today, we are excited to hear about the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture Waterfront Civic Cultural Space Planning Study. It's a little bit of a mouthful. Which surveys existing civic and cultural facilities of public accommodation, also known as FPAs, and provides recommendations on the city's RFI process. We want to do a quick Zoom poll to learn more about the folks here today. And so I'm going to launch that now. If you have a moment, we'd love to get to know you a little better. So there should be a poll up. Feel free to answer it, and I will announce the results once we're in. Alrighty. It looks like the answering has slowed down a little bit, so I'm going to end the poll and display the results. Okay, so it seems like a number of people are here who are artists and community members. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. And most people live and work in Boston, or at least the waterfront, which is even better. So glad you guys can use the FPA spaces around Boston. And finally, we have the people who are decently familiar with the project. Most people understand or have read the draft recommendations. And if this is your very first time hearing about the study or you're not familiar with FPAs, we're really excited to share more with you. FPAs are facilities of public accommodation, and they allow people to freely use the space made available to them, whether or not they are part of the organization or there for the building specifically. Everyone is allowed to use the space, including public restrooms, restaurants, hotel lobbies. All of these spaces are welcome and open to you, and you should feel free to take advantage of them. We have a map of all of these amenities on our website, and we can post that in chat in just a moment. Alrighty. Thank you everyone for filling out the poll and so much for joining us. Here's a little bit more about the study we're about to hear from. The Waterfront Civic Cultural Space Planning Study was intended to assess the existing and pending civic cultural uses and future opportunities across the waterfront in Boston to inform a more equitable planning, design, and tenanting approaches for the space provided through Chapter 91 regulations. At its core, this planning study informs ongoing development projects with relevant civic, cultural, FPA, and affordable retail space commitments, particularly in neighborhoods such as Dorchester, Fort Point, Charlestown, and East Boston. Today, we're going to be joined by three different planners who work on the study: Jared Staley, Cultural Planning Project Manager at the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture; Rich McGinnis, Deputy Director for Climate Change and Environmental at the Boston Planning Development Agency; and Jenna Miko Kaplan, Community Impact Manager at Eisenberg Project. After the presentation, we'll open it up to conversation with all of you in attendance. But Jared, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kelly, and thank you for having me. I'm really excited to share this with everyone. For those of you who have been along with us throughout the entire review planning process or have read the draft recommendations, this presentation will look very familiar. For those of you that are new to this will be a great learning opportunity for you, and I'm happy to take questions at the end. I do want to acknowledge Rich McGinnis with the BPDA again, who has been a great partner in this work. And then Jenna Miko Kaplan with Eisenberg Projects is representing our consultant team. So I do know it's a really long title, and as somebody who does not really like long titles, I apologize, but this was probably the most descriptive I could get. So the Waterfront Civic Cultural Space Planning Study is focused on civic cultural FPAs, facilities of public accommodations, that are made available through Chapter 91 regulations. So the extent of this study really focused specifically on that civic cultural piece. There are other FPAs, as Kelly alluded to, that may be retail, restaurants, hotel lobbies, etc. This study solely focused on the civic cultural uses made available through Chapter 91. So the overview of our scope really was broken down in three parts. First, we wanted to better understand the FPAs that already exist or that are projected, whether they have finalized their Article 80 process with the City of Boston. They're in the process of getting licensure through Mass DEP, et cetera. We just really wanted to understand, where are these FPA spaces, specifically the civic cultural spaces. And then we wanted to do quote unquote a market analysis. It's really difficult to do a full market analysis of FPA spaces because they are fairly few and far between, given the larger context of Boston and Boston's commercial space availability. So we really wanted to better understand more about the how these organizations identify how much space they're using, et cetera. But it really wasn't a full market analysis of understanding rent structure, what is possible, et cetera. We would need to do more digging to really uncover that, which you'll learn about later in the presentation. And then the last task is really documenting barriers and recommendations to overcome those barriers. Whether they be real or perceived barriers, it was important for us to understand what is preventing organizations from taking advantage of these FPA spaces. The City of Boston, the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture, came in with some documentation of barriers already, some things that we already knew, but we also wanted to uncover new barriers or barriers that we weren't aware of but are top of mind for the civic and cultural users in Boston. These barriers also include how we tenant the space and how space gets delivered to really make sure that we're taking advantage of the entire process. The Eisenberg and agency team did a great job of really doing their research, connecting with users, the arts and culture ecosystem in Boston to really better understand all of these different aspects. So Eisenberg and agency had looked at the licensures from Mass DEP, had interviews with myself, Rich, and others at MOAC and BPDA, looked at other cities around the country, as well as talked directly or interviewed directly with developers and space users. Eisenberg and agency also had a consortium of users to help inform this process. They're all listed here: 826 Boston, Dunamis Boston, Embrace, Save the Harbor, Save the Bay, Youth Build Boston, the American City Coalition, and the Flavor Continues. In addition, there was a digital survey that was sent out, distributed by Eisenberg and agency, as well as our office through our newsletter, that also garnered some feedback from the broader arts and culture ecosystem. So how do these spaces emerge? Generally, there are two paths for civic cultural FPA space to emerge or be considered. Eventually, that gets incorporated into a Chapter 91 license. That is what Mass DEP approves and decides. However, the city has a major role in determining where arts and culture uses are needed. And we can do that through our municipal harbor plans or other plans, as well as the Article 80 process. If you're familiar with Boston's development process, Article 80 is a great opportunity for community feedback, input, etc. But it's also an opportunity for city departments to engage with developers and start to mold a development project to fit the needs of the city. As I said, that all gets codified then into what we call a Chapter 91 license. That is issued by Mass DEP. However, it does receive input from the City of Boston. So to be clear, Mass DEP oversees, manages, and issues licenses with input from the city. The city does not issue licenses. So existing spaces. There are currently 23 civic cultural FPA spaces today, quantifying that out to about almost 500,000 square feet of space. On this map here, the black dots indicate FPA spaces, civic cultural FPA spaces. They range from nonprofit facilities to galleries and the like. Again, this is only civic cultural space. There are other FPA spaces that are not mapped here. We anticipate roughly 9 future civic cultural FPA spaces. We do have 3 that are confirmed, and that's about 150,000 square feet over the next 5 to 10 years. Some of these spaces are completed or have completed their Article 80 process, are currently in their licensing process with Mass DEP. Others have recently received Mass DEP licenses. But we will be working with these entities, developers, owners on how we want to go about the tenanting process for these spaces. Before we get into some of the recommendations, I want to talk a little bit about the barriers in the tenanting process. So some of the barriers you'll see on the left-hand side, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but over here, were already determined by our office and others at the city just through our conversations historically with organizations. So space terms, the lease terms, was one barrier. For small organizations, they can't fill large spaces, vice versa is the same. Property taxes tend to be a very large barrier to entry for a lot of organizations. It's great that these spaces are free or at reduced rates. However, property taxes, along with other operating expenses, can be prohibitive to organizations for occupying and really functioning in these spaces. The timing of delivery is also another challenge, and to be clear and upfront and honest, we haven't really nailed down exactly when the right time to deliver space or start the RFI process is. That's something we still will work on. But ensuring that we're timing it correctly is incredibly important. If we are waiting until construction is almost finished, but we have a great organization that the owner really likes, it would fill a gap in the civic cultural market. But the construction is so far along that they can't make too many changes without incurring too many costs. It becomes a difficult prospect. The tenanting process itself, so awareness of our RFI, RFP process is another barrier, as well as the space delivery conditions related to the timing. Other barriers that were identified through the study are just awareness of what FPA spaces are, the inequitable public processes, the density of these FPA spaces in particular neighborhoods. There's no real definition of success for FPAs. There's often a mismatch of size and capacity, mismatch of orgs and, that need space versus the use. And then the build out and public facility obligations on some organizations. This just provides a little bit more detail around those documentation of barriers. The Eisenberg and agency team, or teams rather, provided us with a great report on these barriers that will soon be posted. This is kind of part of their work, but it's not incorporated into the final recommendations per se, but informed recommendations. So awareness of space really affects the organizations. Inequitable public processes also affects organizations and developers. The density of FPAs in the seaport is a barrier for organizations that becomes a little bit difficult for us to manage, as Chapter 91 is state regulation and is dependent on the historic sea line. No definition of success. This is something that we could solve for. This does affect organizations and developers alike. And then the mismatch of size and capacity, mismatch of orgs and use and build out all affect organizations, with mismatch of size and capacity affecting developers as well. The intent with this is to ensure that there's clarity both for potential end users as well as the developer and city when FPA spaces become available or discussed through one of the aforementioned processes, MHPs or RFP. So that's all of what has been done through this process. Kind of looking forward, Eisenberg and agency provided a lot of great recommendations for us. The rest of this presentation is not going to cover every single one of those recommendations. I encourage folks to explore the full report posted on our website. The final report should be posted within about a week or so. But we'll cover at least one recommendation from each of these three buckets. And we really wanted to highlight some specific ones that we're excited about to dig into. So the three different buckets are Chapter 91, should be an effective tool for civic cultural FBAs to bridge gaps in Boston's cultural landscape. The public RFI process should stress direct communication and transparency. And three, the build out of FPA space should be diverse and benefit the current civic cultural user base. This is a general overview of all of the recommendations, just by name. There are more details on our website. The first one that I want to talk about is really just standardizing language around Chapter 91. As you've noticed, I've said civic cultural, FPA is just FPA. What is Chapter 91? Who is Mass DEP? What are the requirements? All of this can become standardized so that when we talk about this publicly, when we go to licensing, etc., that everyone is understanding of what we mean. This could include defining what civic cultural space means. It can also include a less frequently used term, which called SPDIF, SPDF, there we go. So that's another term that is not technically in the regulation, but has been used in municipal harbor plans, et cetera, and really indicates the cultural FBA spaces. But providing clarity of language is incredibly important around this topic, ensuring that everybody in the community is aware of what is going on and what requirements exist. That isn't to say that every FPA license needs to be exactly the same, but there are ways that we can standardize this process to make it easier on everyone. The second is really prioritizing ground floor visibility of civic cultural FPA spaces. This means, having a ground floor entry, ground floor activation and space so that folks who are just passing by can see into and are aware that an organization is occupying that space, that it is an FPA, et cetera. This also includes posting public hours, access hours. If it's a bookable space, if it's more of a community-oriented room, having something there where you can go to a website, there's a contact person, et cetera, on how you can book that space is also important. Another thing that we've seen as we did some site visits is some locations actually had the license number posted next to the door. And so that's a great way that then you can do your own research on what is in that license, what are the requirements, et cetera. But right now there is inconsistency in what is posted, as well as just the design of the FPA space and how visible that might be from the ground plane. One thing I would like to note is on the right-hand side here, there's a section about responsible actors. For the most part, that is Mass DEP, my office, Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture, as well as the BPDA. A number of these recommendations do require the coordination of other departments, including Mass DEP. Again, Mass DEP oversees Chapter 91 in the licensing process, so they will be at the table. They have seen these recommendations and have been supportive of these recommendations. Kind of building off of that ground floor visibility is also just visibility in general of FPA spaces. Boston Harbor now has a fantastic resource, a map of FPA spaces. However, I think it's also important that the city provide a portal with information regarding FPA spaces that could include a map of where these FPA spaces are located, similar to our privately owned public space map the city has, but also include other information such as RFI and RFP response templates, license templates, a breakdown of what civic cultural FPA spaces are, what they mean, and how they impact the city. A website such as this could be an invaluable tool to really make sure that the community, users, developers, and the city are all on the same page of what it means to have a civic cultural FPA space. We should have, as I mentioned on the portal page, a template for responding to our RFI and RFP processes. And this really would benefit the organizations who are applying to fill these spaces. Right now, our general process requires a letter of intent with some information, and then we may ask for supplemental information, et cetera. That is okay, but we can improve upon that and provide a little bit more detail and clarity for organizations, especially smaller organizations who would greatly benefit from this space, but may not have the capacity to fill out a response all on their own from a blank slate. So providing a template could be a great way for us to ensure that this is an equitable process for everyone. Making sure that we publicize the tenant improvement allowance at the start of RFI processes. So those who aren't aware, tenant improvement allowances are essentially a dollar figure per square foot that a developer would provide an incoming tenant to fit out the space to their needs. Right now, the general TI allowance or tenant improvement allowance is around $50 per square foot, which isn't quite sufficient for the needs of most organizations. However, kind of going back to that market analysis and not having enough of comparables around the area, it's really hard for us to define what that number is. So, but as a midway point, it's really important that we do publicize that information up front, ensuring that organizations who are interested in the space are aware of the financial impacts that they might experience trying to move into a space. Another aspect of this is standardizing rent across the FBA spaces. Right now, it generally ranges from $0 to $10 per square foot per year, which is great. It's a low cost rent. However, it is inconsistent across the board, and ensuring that people, organizations who are interested in this space can prepare accordingly. It's important that we do have some consistency in what that rent basis will be. I would like to note here that in general, related to the finances, it is incumbent upon the owner/developer to ensure that these spaces are successful for the duration of their licensure. So right now, it's been difficult for us to assign a lot of numbers to things, but the general kind of recommendation right now is that these spaces need to be successful, and we need to be able to work with developers and owners to ensure that they are successful into the future. And so there is some fluctuation in rent basis, TI, et cetera, depending on the project, et cetera. But since we've completed this draft study, we've been very clear with organizations and developers that it is incumbent upon the developer to ensure that these spaces will be successful. Again, standardizing real estate taxes for FBA tenants. This kind of gets back to the operating expenses of space. Real estate taxes can be very cost prohibitive, especially in the seaport and 4-point areas for smaller organizations or general nonprofit organizations. While real estate tax law is very difficult to reduce real estate tax burden, the city is committed to working with organizations and developers to limit that as much as possible. However, we do not make any guarantees on what that number looks like. It also is dependent. In general, all FPA spaces are rental. It gets a little bit easier sometimes when the civic cultural space is condoed to reduce that tax burden. But we are aware that this is a major tax burden and major burden for organizations, and we want to make sure that this, again, these spaces are successful into perpetuity. Another aspect of this is standardizing the space delivery. Another report that the Eisenberg and agency teams provided was really a typology of sorts of the different potential civic cultural users who might occupy these spaces. And if the city is able to work with a developer in enough of a time frame and advancement to identify which typology would be best suited for the specific site, we can then break that down a little bit further and identify some of the specific delivery needs. One great example is the number of outlets in a space. For some organizations who might just need administrative office or less demand on an energy supply, don't need as many outlets, performing arts groups, et cetera, maker spaces, are going to demand more on energy and electricity and may need more outlets. So It's a very like specific example of how that could look. But in general, making sure that there's a standardized space delivery depending on the typology. I will also say there is a standard delivery that we can do regardless of typology. So as we continue to work with developers and organizations on progressing and implementing this work, we can identify very specific things that how we would like space to be delivered to be most utilized by a broad group of organizations. That's it for the recommendations that we had prepared for today's conversations. There was a community meeting regarding these recommendations, and then there was also a community comment period for this. I received 6 comment letters in total from advocates, developers, local cultural users, etc. All 6 of those comment letters were very substantial in their recommendations or in their comments, but they can be bucketed into approximately 3 groupings. One is really coordination, and a number of the letters that I received really highlighted a concern around the coordination between the 3 public entities, Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture, the BPDA, and Mass DEP. Others, in very specific instances, identified a need for coordination with the MBTA and other transportation management agencies. I will say the BPDA and our office, Rich and I, have been working very closely through this entire process and will continue to work very closely as Chapter 91 FPA spaces become available or are discussed. So there is a close-knit coordination right there. And as I said a little bit earlier in the presentation, all of these recommendations were kind of run by Mass DEP and received sign-off from them. We are still working on, or I'm still working on having a little bit more regular coordination with Mass DEP so that we can ensure that these recommendations can be implemented and will be successful. Other comments can be bucketed into a need for further study. One that I already mentioned is really the economics. Just given the typology, the civic cultural use, and the limits of FPA spaces, specifically civic cultural FPA spaces in these geographies, it's really difficult to do any comparable comparisons. But we can continue to explore that and seek guidance. There's also a little bit more information that we might need around transportation access. And again, that's where we would need to coordinate with transportation management agencies. And then just some a little bit more thinking, further study on ensuring compliance, both from eventual tenants as well as owners, developers of space. There were a couple of recommendations, or at least one recommendation in the full report around having tenants provide an annual compliance report. There were some comments around that, ensuring that it's not just the tenants, it's also a conversation with developers. And then the third bucket is really just some corrections. There was some unclear language regarding our role, the city's role in the Chapter 91 process. I think there was just a misunderstanding of an and. So we resolved that in the final report. And then I talked about this a little bit earlier, a need for consistent terminology and less quote unquote wonky or policy language, defining what civic cultural uses are, what that means, making sure that we're consistent in our use of FPA or SPDF, as well as other Chapter 91 terminology. And then there were just some slight errors in some map indicators that we missed before we published the report, and those will be corrected in the final report. That was a very quick presentation. Again, it was not the entirety of the report, ultimately because that would mean we're here until about noon going over that. But I am happy to take questions on either the report or what I presented today.
Thank you so much, Jared. Yes, we would love to get everyone's thoughts, questions that they have. And so I will be monitoring both the chat and the raise hand function. I'll be making sure that people who haven't got a chance to speak kind of get prioritized, and then we'll go back around if there are people who have more questions. But yeah, let's start it off. I do see that Steve Hollinger has his hand raised. So Steve, I will kick it to you.
Hi, thank you. First of all, I'd like to state one concern and then a few comments. And I do also want to say first, I really appreciate the work, and I think progress has been made. Especially, I really appreciate the move toward equity in access to these opportunities, as opposed to, more local and inside work getting tenancies. So I really appreciate progress and this study in identifying barriers. One concern from this particular presentation, I think there was a suggestion that rents have been all over the place in terms of negotiations, but really every single tenancy I'm familiar with in civicultural FPAs, although I don't know the ICA deal for the Pier 4 space, but every single other one has been base rent free and there's a nominal fee. Typically, it's not $1 per square foot or $10 per square foot. It's $10 annually, period, as I understand the deals, or $1 per year, not per square foot. So the range has basically been free. The spaces have been provided free of charge at what I would say is a nominal fee of $10 per year. That changed only recently for the first time in my entire history of Chapter 91 permitting, and I've always repeated this, about 25 years now. In our neighborhood, the latest FPA for the first time ever is allowing the developer to determine the rent at their discretion with input from MOAC, as opposed to saying base rent free in the BPDA legal documents. It says heavily subsidized base rent that will be determined with input from the city of Boston's mayor of Office of Arts and Culture. So that shift is very concerning, that we've gone from base rent free for 25 years of precedent stated in BPDA, PDAs, development plans, and DEP agreements, although DEP usually doesn't put the rent in, I don't think, but BPDA has. Now we've suddenly moved toward a rent at the discretion of the developer. And as far as what I've gotten pushback on by saying to BPDA about that is I've heard, well, we negotiated free taxes at that space. Well, if I go back to 15 Necco, 15 Necco had free base rent and no taxes, and common fees were paid for. I'll read the legalese at 15 Necco was for a nominal sum of $10 annually, which sum shall include any applicable taxes and common area maintenance. So I don't know, but it seems to me like we've gone backwards in terms of placing a burden on these cultural spaces. And I'll allow for other people to make comments and then you circle back later because I have some other comments on the study. But again, thanks again for the work, Jared and Eisenberg Projects.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Actually, this is Sarah from Harborfront. Could Jared or Rich respond to Steve? Because I share that concern, and as others do, on this shift in rent and what it really means and when it's determined. Because when it goes through Article 80, Jared talked about how important it was to kind of have things, leveraging Chapter 91 during Article 80 and BPDA approval. So so rent has always been part of that approval process, as Steve mentioned, and this seems very nebulous and disturbing language. So if Jared or Rich could respond, that would be great.
Yeah, so I'll say first and foremost, the intent of this study and the intent for moving forward is not to place any more burden on organizations or users. In fact, it's quite the opposite, is to reduce the burden as much as possible to ensure the success of these spaces. In the particular project that you're speaking about, I had conversations with that developer, and I think we will need to be a little bit better about the board documents. But in those conversations, we agreed that rent would likely not be possible of any kind on that space. So the intent there is that, again, it would be heavily subsidized just like any other Chapter 91 space, in ensuring the success of that civic cultural FBA space. And in that conversation, we touched a little bit on a retail FBA space that is not civic cultural, and that was the same understanding for that, though my office has no purview over that other space. So the intent here is certainly to reduce the burden on organizations for occupying this space as much as possible. It's something I certainly can look into and follow a little bit more closely as we move forward, or that project moves forward in licensing and other approvals, and referring to other BPDA board documents to ensure that there is consistency. Again, a prime recommendation from this report is to ensure that there is consistency and transparency moving forward. So.
Great, thank you, Jared. I want to read a question in the chat from Rebecca Shore. Is there a model or exemplar city that you'd like Boston to aim for or kind of model after in terms of their FPAs or sort of like civic cultural tenanting?
I don't know that there is. At least there's not one that we've talked about in depth within the office. I know Eisenberg and agency refer to other cities, such as the city of Seattle, in doing this work. I think we're a little bit in uncharted territory, especially in regards to civic cultural space. I think cultural planning as a field and practice of the broader planning discipline is relatively new in the US. And so really thinking critically about how we're supporting arts and culture users is kind of brand new, and it's been very difficult across the board to identify exemplar cities. Not that other cities across the country aren't doing good work. It's often that the mechanics of how that work gets done, where the economics are coming from, et cetera, are so different from Boston that's really difficult to have a comparable city. But I think overall we've been moving forward in the hopes that we can be that exemplar city in regards to providing civic and cultural space. I think I would also say, while this study specifically focused on FPAs and in regards to Chapter 91, a lot of what we learned through this study can and will likely be applied across the city when it comes to affordable cultural space. We have provisions in other neighborhoods that provide affordable cultural space. And so that kind of like RFI tenanting process, the delivery conditions, et cetera, has been really informative to ensure that this isn't just used in Chapter 91. Some of the mechanics we can use across the city, and we hope to do that.
Great, thank you. And glad you guys were pioneering this. Okay, there's a few more questions in the chat. There's a lot of people who want to know if it's possible to, one, get this PowerPoint afterwards, and two, Tom Reddy specifically would like to know if the list of cultural and FPAs Jared showed on the map be provided. I believe you had a map of all of the civic cultural FPAs, but I don't know that they were labeled per se. I think he's looking for that list in particular.
The map itself is in the recommendations. This presentation is actually a copy of our April 10th presentation. I can certainly post it again or share it with you, Kelly, to distribute. But the presentation should already be posted as well. In terms of getting like a labeled list, that's something I can work on, and hopefully no one will need to ask me again, because we'll have a website by the end of the year with all of this information.
Awesome, lovely. Okay, just want to remind people that if you want to virtually raise your hand, I actually can't see anyone physically raising their hand in video. So if you are doing that, please make sure to digitally raise your hand. It is in the reaction section, or at least it is for me. And you can also feel free to post something in the chat. I am monitoring that as well. Steve, I see your hand raised, but I also see Sarah McCammond. So you guys have both already spoken. Steve, I'm going to let you go first, and then Sarah. And once again, if anyone else wants to raise their hand, ask a question, or if you want to put something in the chat, please feel free to do so. Steve, go ahead.
Thanks, Kelly. And Kelly, thank you for hosting. I appreciate that. Well, first of all, for the answer to a great example city, I would point to Boston. Because if you look at the Fan Pier permit issued in 2001 or 2000, including the municipal harbor plan and the BPDA or the BRA work at that time, and we had, Fort Point was roughly 750 to 800 artists strong, lobbying for cultural uses on Fan Pier. And Fan Pier's Chapter 91 permit included 107,000 square feet of interior civic cultural FPA spaces, including the Grub Street space today, including ICA ground floor space, including 23,000 square feet coming up on Parcel H, which could be a massive opportunity, and including the community boating space and so on. So Fan Pier, and there's also the building that now hosts an oyster bar with liquor license, was supposed to be a civicultural FPA for low-cost sale rentals of rods and reels, but BPDA allowed that space to be commercialized. Anyways, Fan Pier's license is fantastic. It hasn't, we've never gotten anything close to that in the terms of density, the project size, to the quality of civicultural FPAs. And I just would point out, I'm just going to point out one concern about the study that I think really needs to be focused on, that these, the diversity, equity, inclusion, all these issues are not only going to be satisfied in the seaport by satisfying tenants, the identification of tenants to bring more diversity to the seaport. The focus really has to be on the people coming to the seaport and improving the inclusion, equity, diversity of people who want to come to the seaport. And that means people who want to visit these spaces. Now, that goes directly to the economics of what is being provided by these spaces. And that goes to free public programming. So the expectation on a deeply subsidized $1 per year space should be that the civic cultural organization should be in a position to not only do revenue generating events at $20 per ticket, but also providing very high quality free public programming. And that has to be benchmarked, because right now in the seaport, it isn't benchmarked, and the spaces are really being used all sorts of ways, but there is kind of a little bit of a shift toward revenue generation as the highest priority. And that lowers the probability that you're going to have a diverse audience coming to the seaport. So I think the visitor, or who the visitor that we want to identify, should be a high priority in the study, not just the tenant themselves. I think for now, I'll let it go at that. I do have other things. I wrote a 9-page comment letter, and I think some of the other stuff is in there, but I'll leave it at that for now. And again, thanks for this forum.
Thanks, Steve.
Alrighty, sorry, Sarah, I want to hop the line because I saw that Tom has his hand raised and Tom hasn't had a chance to speak yet. So Tom, I'm going to kick it to you.
Thanks, Kelly, and thanks for hosting. Thanks, Jared, for getting on. A simple question, I guess, as it relates to civic uses, how is the city of Boston's possible civic use of space, I guess, being understood and or addressed? So an example could or would be a branch library. An example could or would be a BCYF center, Parks and Rec space next to a City of Boston park. Those kinds of, so it kind of points specifically to the fact that there is no City of Boston space in zip code 02210, and that creates a whole number of problems, and certainly hope that Chapter 91 spaces could be a means to solve some of that. I'm just curious, Jared, how are city uses being addressed through this process? Thank you.
Yeah, so in this instance, the term civic has been more used for community meeting rooms and the like. Rich and I have had conversations about what would it look like for certain social services or community-oriented organizations to be implemented through Chapter 91 FPA spaces. We haven't seen that yet. And in terms of specific city services like a BPL or school, BCYF, et cetera, that was not explored through this. And right now, the current thinking is that this is meant to be a resource for the broader organizations, et cetera. And we would need to do specific studies with those sister agencies to identify sites, et cetera. I'm not saying it's a no. It was just not a part of the consideration for this study. And I think we would need to do more internal thinking around whether or not public facilities, city-owned and ran facilities, would be incorporated into Chapter 91 FPA spaces.
Thanks, Jared. Okay, I want to give it over to Sarah McCammond, and then I'm going to read some questions from the chat.
Thank you, Kelly, and thanks for bringing us and convening us all together on this important topic. I'm just going to add a little comment I wasn't going to say before, but Jared, we spoke and talked about civic spaces and the inclusion of civic spaces in this study. So I'm really disappointed that community centers and the like weren't really evaluated. I feel that this is a big mess, and I'd like to understand better what you're considering a civic space versus a cultural space. I know you had mentioned that you're going to be defining that. So if it's going to be coming out in definitions, I think that's something that we'd like to respond to. And then, so that's just, one comment. And then you had spoke about other clarity and terminology. And so we had highlighted that office space in Chapter 91 space is not FPA. So I just want to make sure that the definitions of FPA get in sync with what Chapter 91 definitions are, so that going forward, someone can't think that we could have a nonprofit co-working space or just offices for a nonprofit that is doing their programming outside of that space. So I think there just needs to be a little bit more clarity and definition there. And so I have some other comments too, but I will leave it at that and let Kelly to go to the chat, and maybe if there's time, come back to me. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah.
Aaliyah Zwire from Safe Harbor, Safe Bay would like to know if there is going to be an additional update once public comments are taken into account.
So I am finalizing some last minute things within the report, and the report will ideally be posted next week. I would say in the very near future, it'll be posted along with documentation of barriers and some other content that Eisenberg and agency produced for us. In terms of like a full public meeting, that wasn't something that we had considered. The intent was to respond and modify the report based on the comments that we received and post that. That way we can start to move into implementation and get to some of the important details like definitions and making sure that we have consistency. So I do expect that there will be continuous or fairly regular updates from this process as we move into implementation and proceed.
Great, thank you. And then I'm going to take a minute to let myself hop in and ask a question.
Sure.
For the RFI process, which I know we didn't talk a super lot about here, do you know if there's going to be sort of like public input community meetings about around RFIs? Or is it going to be an
Yes.
internal process?
It'll be a combination. So I think the best example that we have right now is the Lovejoy Wharf RFI RFP. That was ran by the BPDA. And I can describe a little bit more about what that process looks like. But that has become kind of our baseline. And I think we can start to improve and think about how we can do better from that. But that was a pretty exemplary process. And in that instance, it was representatives from the BPDA, the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture, as well as ownership / developer of that space, formed an evaluation committee. The BPDA, as the public entity, issued the RFI / RFP details. That was all done in coordination with the owner developer of the space, as well as our office. We then received letters of intent, along with some supplemental information. The evaluation committee, as I had already described, made up of the owner, BPDA, and MOAC, reviewed that content, and then we held a public meeting and invited the organizations that had submitted letters of interest to present their proposed use of that space. And in that, we had a time for comments and questions of those organizations from the public. There was I believe, a 2-week, maybe even a 30-day comment period related to all of that. And for the substantive comments, we took those into consideration in our deliberation and in deciding in concert with the owner of who was the best candidate for that space. And so that is like the general outline of how we anticipate future RFI and RFPs to proceed. In fact, I've modeled other cultural space availability in different neighborhoods off of that process, because it seemed like it was a pretty successful one. And in every instance where we want to make sure that the developer / owner is involved in that selection process, because they do have a fiduciary responsibility for that space. We want to make sure that those owners, developers are involved and feel comfortable with that tenant from a financial standpoint. Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture can provide some context around the needs of the cultural space community and the ecosystem, what gaps we have. And then the BPDA can also provide some planning consideration and thinking. So it is really a collaborative effort. It is not the city deciding in a back room somewhere or anything like that. It is a collaborative discussion with the owner and the two city entities, as well as a public component.
Great, thank you. And I'm also seeing a little bit of like love for the Lovejoy Wharf process. People seem to have enjoyed that. Steve Hollinger, related to that, says hats off to the BPDA and MOAC for the Lovejoy process. Well done, and I'm excited about the selected tenant. So people seem to like Lovejoy Wharf as a model.
Yeah, I'm very excited. I think we have a great tenant moving in. They just had their ribbon cutting, their launch early this month, I believe. So I encourage everyone to go check it out.
Great. Okay. We have more questions coming in the chat. Sarah McCammond has a follow-up from Aaliyah's question, which was an update on, I guess, the final draft. And Sarah says, given your need to rely on partners, especially DEP for actions, how do you move forward in a final draft and related implementation timeline?
So in terms of the recommendations themselves, Mass DEP has reviewed and signed off on all the recommendations, specifically the ones that they are an active partner in. So they were identified in the document. We made sure to have that discussion with Mass DEP, make sure that they were on board with any recommendation before we even published the draft recommendations, or the draft report rather. So I feel confident that we'll be able to have a collaborative conversation and relationship with Mass DEP to move into implementation. In terms of timing, et cetera, that was taken into consideration in how long it would take to implement some of these items. So in the report and on the pages, actually, just scroll up. Right here, implementation timing 1 to 2 years. So that was taken into consideration. I think we'll be able to publish a final report with these recommendations. I want to emphasize that just because we've published a final report does not mean we've implemented everything. The report is there to hold us accountable and to ensure that we are being transparent with the community about what we intend to do. So as we begin implementation, I do envision that there will be further updates, just kind of documenting what we've done in the last 6, 12, 18, whatever number of months. I think we're still kind of figuring out the best timing for anything like that. But we do, as I said a little bit earlier in the conversation, we do have sites that have FPA space available, and we do want to move forward with those because we don't want space just sitting. So it's a little bit of a balancing act of ensuring that we're moving forward with equity in mind, but also making sure that we can move quickly and not leave space on the table.
Great, thank you. And we have some more questions in the chat. I will, it looks like Sarah has her hand raised, so maybe she has a follow-up to her original question. So Sarah, I'm gonna let you unmute yourself.
Thanks, Kelly. You were reading my mind, but all of a sudden, something with, oh, I know what it was, Jared. So I know that you all, and understandably so, wanted to get the study done before you started the RFP process on a couple spaces that are sort of in queue. And I was trying to just make sure I was interpreting correctly what you were saying. Is that sort of going to be lifted once the final is released, and you will start the process to for RFPs at locations that are just have been waiting for the green light?
Generally speaking, yes, but it's not as if, I publish the final recommendations tomorrow and then on Friday we have 5 RFIs going out. A, I can't handle that capacity. But B, more importantly, we have not sat down with the developers, owners of those properties to discuss our process for moving forward. I do have one organization who is in my inbox wanting to meet to discuss that. As I haven't finalized, I've held off on any kind of conversation around the final recommendations, but I do think there's going to be a period of time in which we're still identifying, here's the immediate things for implementation that we can do right now in these upcoming processes versus here are things that are a little bit longer timeline that are more applicable to future FPA spaces that will come through the Article 80 process or Mass DEP licensing. So it's a little bit of a balancing act again. The intent right now is, yes, we do need to finalize the recommendations, get that published before we proceed with an RFI. However, again, it's not as if all of those properties are going to have RFIs all at once. There's going to be some discussion with those development teams and owners.
Thank you.
Okay, gonna hop back to the chat. V from Ohana New England Dragon Boat unfortunately had to drop off, but I'm gonna read her comment aloud for people who end up watching this recording and can't see the chat. I would support efforts to have long-term accountability for the use of space so organizations selected can continue to provide programs that are open and inclusive. Many organizations are already collaborating toward that goal. It'd be great to have an avenue to see the big picture and to see which spaces can be best used for different purposes. So I don't think you need to answer that question. V unfortunately has hopped off, but she just wanted to make that known. Additionally, Steve Hollander has also put more in the chat as sort of an idea. I'd encourage more consideration of pairing an endowment funded via grants, philanthropy, etc., with the tenancy process to improve the success of cultural tenants and also fulfill the goal of balancing revenue generation with free public programming. In the same vein, regarding supplemental funding, pairing civic funding from external sources, including municipal government, with the creation of civic FPAs under Chapter 91 could produce more than unstaffed rooms with furniture. And then Charlotte Lace from TAC said, we agree with Steve's comment that the study should include a focus on the visitor and delivering high quality free public programming.
I think those are all certainly noted. In terms of visitorship, point well taken. I think the focus of the study was specifically on the user. But under this middle column of further study, I think identifying visitor and doing a little bit more of a market analysis is something that we could think about and see how we can implement that.
Great, thank you. Alrighty, I see no hands actively raised yet or new comments in the chat, although if I have missed yours, please feel free to just ping me. But if you have any questions, I'm gonna give it just a few more seconds to see if anyone has anything else to type something in, virtually raise your hand. Once again, if you are raising your hand on camera, unfortunately, I cannot see you. So please go down to a reaction section and press digital raise hand. And great, we have Tom.
Thanks, Kelly, and thanks, Jared. I guess I just conclude with this. This is all great progress, but I think we all know in the end, it's the state that licenses the spaces. I guess what I'd like the city to try to evolve to is a standard set of language, standard terms, standard fees, all of the kind of things that you talk about that are barriers. Those actually should be objectives that the city is working towards, so that any development that takes place in Chapter 91 space uses those standards, if you would, so that this process becomes super repeatable and advocates don't have to go fight tooth and nail on every single Article 80 project. It just becomes, if you would, rote. It's in the agreements. The state sees them and they issue the license. So thanks for the progress to date, but I really, really do hope that we get a little more consistent in how this all works. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom.
Great. One last call for questions. Once again, feel free to virtually raise your hand or put it in the chat. Yeah,
I'm trying to raise my hand. Sorry, Kelly, to interrupt.
go for it.
I'm in Zoom Workplace now. Everything has changed.
Go for it.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank the Mayor's Office of Arts and Culture in the city and Eisenberg for organizing this this set of meetings and also the work. I did want to raise again my comment from the previous meeting, which is trying to work through a way of integrating with the design review process. That so many of the success of these spaces is really in dealing with how they are executed in terms of the design. We did not provide written comments on that basis, but we can if that is useful.
You are certainly welcome to comment and email me. I think the point is taken. I think that's been something that has been kind of inherent in my work at MOAC outside of Chapter 91, but including Chapter 91, is just ensuring, we have all of these different processes that sort of follow a chapter or a Article 80 approval from the BPDA, one of which is including design review from the BPDA. And it's important to me that the city is aligned during those processes. So when we do communicate with the community or developer, we're all in agreement. So that is something that, if you want to send in a comment, you're welcome to do that. But I think as part of my role within MOAC has been something that I've taken on and will continue to do.
All right, Sarah. Oh, and thank you, Raber, for being here.
Could you talk a little bit about, I know that MOAC and BPDA have been working closely together on this, and will that continue beyond the recommendations and implementation of the recommendations, so that there are, will they always be a partner, or will you always be partners with each other from the city side in this endeavor?
Yes, is the short answer. We'll continue to be partners. That might look a little differently depending on the project and who I'm working with, but Rich and I have a bi-weekly check-in regarding these topics, and so we coordinate pretty closely. And then there is Alana Holmes at the BPDA on the compliance side, or I forget the sub-department, but I think it's Article 80 compliance or regulatory compliance side, who is also focused on Chapter 91, and we've been coordinating frequently as well, related not just to these recommendations, but also just kind of larger Chapter 91 and how that gets integrated into Article 80. So there is a lot of coordination happening. In addition to those more regular check-ins, this presentation I gave also to BPDA leadership, including planning staff, development review, real estate, and others. And so there is, the BPDA is well aware of these recommendations. We're going to start working on how this gets communicated to project managers, so it's not just incumbent upon me being in the room or what have you, but everybody is fully aware of, you know, these processes and how we're moving forward. And to some earlier points around the standardization of this.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you. I'm gonna hop in with a question from the chat. Someone wanted to know if it would be possible to post the comment letters that you received on the website.
Yes, I will work with our comms team to do that.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to pass it off to Steve one last time.
Okay, just when you thought you heard the last of me, I have one concern just to float out there, that there is a intensity about focusing on the initial tenant in these spaces, and that goes to the build out. And I do support the idea of the design being integral, the BCDC process even being integral to the success of these spaces. And we've known that for a very long time, that certain spaces just don't work. Going back to BPD has received input from people dating back long years from cultural organizations. But the one issue I have with focusing on the initial tenant and you know, where the initial subsidy for build out goes based on that initial tenant, is that the developers have a record of focusing on particular types of tenants because that initial tenant gets the build out costs. And I think to some degree, there has to be some thought put in longer term after that initial tenant of the types of possible tenants that the space might have. So for that reason, I've always advocated for really serious, very high quality, flexible spaces that could be adapted to a wide variety of uses, including the high ceilings for performance, but also other things for other types of uses. And just to point out that, you know, in some instances where we've had space, a developer will say, well, we interviewed 5 people and they all agree it can be on an upper floor. They don't need a ground floor. So therefore, we're going to go for an upper floor in our project. That's the kind of press you have when you put so much emphasis on who the first tenant is. So I would encourage more thinking about long-term 65-year Chapter 91 licenses and how these spaces could be designed to be extremely flexible. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. I certainly agree. You know, the ICA teen space was formerly the Society of Arts and Crafts, second floor space. I think a couple of our recommendations get to your points. One, ensuring that there's ground floor visibility. Me professionally, I don't think an entryway is enough ground floor visibility. These spaces do need to be seen by the public. And the other, I think that particular space and process, was something that we did discuss with agency and Eisenberg. It was not in the recommendations that I presented today, but there is at least one recommendation or allusion to ensuring, you know, if there is a re-tenanting process, what does that look like, and making sure we define that. I think ultimately, though, we want to make sure that the intent behind this is to make sure that we have one entity in that space through the duration. However, things happen, economics change, etc. So being prepared for those eventualities is something that we want to take a look into. But you're absolutely right. The focus of this presentation and these recommendations were really much more focused on the initial onset, where I think there's just a lot more happening that needs to be solved for. That isn't to say it's not important what happens with a second or potentially third tenant, but points well taken.
Great. Thank you so much. It looks like we're winding down on questions on hand raised. So with that, I want to say a final thank you to Jared for presenting and also Rich McGinnis and Jennifer Amico Kaplan for being here. I want to thank you all for joining us this morning. A recording of this forum and some of our other past forums can be found at this YouTube link, which I'm going to post in the chat in just a second. And then you can learn more about all of Boston Harbor Now's upcoming events at bostonharbornow.org by signing up for our monthly email updates. This is where you will often find about Harbor Use public forums and following us on social media. I do want to give a quick plug to our next Harbor Use public forum, which will be in person. It will be at the Charlestown Navy Yard, and we will be walking around Boston Public Art Triennial. I'm sorry, they changed their name recently. They're formerly Now and Theirs 2024 Lot Lab. And so if you're interested in public art and the process of doing sort of outdoor public, I'm gonna say this wrong, but like larger pieces, please feel free to join us. That Eventbrite will be coming out soon, and you will likely see it in one of our Boston Harbor Now newsletters. So yeah, hope to see you there, and thank you guys so much for joining us. Link to all of our past Harbor Use public forums is here. And thank you so much once again, Jared, for presenting, and we really appreciate you all for being here. Hope you have a good rest of your Wednesday. And if you guys have any closing thoughts, feel free to add them too.
Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Bye all.